Let's see. Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Eric Goldstein. I'm the director of the TAM Institute for Jewish Studies at Emory University, and I'm pleased that so many of you could join us this evening via Zoom for a special celebration of Miriam Udel's new book, Honey on the Page, a treasury of Yiddish children's literature, which, as you know, is hot off the presses of New York University Press. The publication of a new book is a momentous event in a scholar's life, and so we wanted to mark this milestone by bringing together friends, colleagues, and members of the reading public to hear about how Honey on the Page came about, what it signifies in the world of Yiddish letters and in Jewish studies more broadly, and most importantly, to let you know how you can purchase a copy. Since traditional book signings are made impossible by the current COVID-19 moment that we are experiencing, we have devised a creative way to get to the same destination. Each of you who registered for this program will receive a follow-up email tomorrow with instructions on how to contact Danielle Patron in our Jewish Studies office and to request an autographed book plate signed by Miriam, as well as a special Honey on the Page bookmark. And you can also follow the links on this follow-up email to purchase the book, or you can purchase it from your choice of vendor and then affix the signed book plate to your copy. It will be just like Miriam signed it in person for you. If somehow you don't receive the follow-up email, or if it happens to go into your spam folder, you can always find us via our website at js.emory.edu. While I have your attention, I'd like to thank our staff members, Danielle Patron, who is our communications coordinator, and also our new executive director, Paul Entis, for making this program possible. And I also want to take a few seconds to encourage you to attend our upcoming annual Rabbi Jacob M. Rothschild Memorial Lecture, which will take place on Thursday, October 29th at 7:30 p.m., also on Zoom. And it will feature the civil rights expert Eric Ward speaking on Skin in the Game, American Jews, Whiteness, and the Contemporary Movement for Racial Justice. And again, you can visit js.emory.edu for more information. Our program tonight will be conducted in interview fashion, with Miriam, of course, as the interviewee, and our colleague Marshall Duke from the Department of Psychology as the interviewer. Once they have had a chance to converse about the book, we will open it up to questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit questions, and you can even start to do that before the question and answer period begins. I will be fielding the questions, and I will try to keep up with them and to convey them to the speakers and the audience so that we can have a rich discussion. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our two featured guests. Miriam Udel is Associate Professor of German Studies and Jewish Studies at Emory, where her teaching focuses on Yiddish language, literature, and culture. She holds an A.B. in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from Harvard University, as well as a PhD in Comparative Literature from the same institution. She was also ordained in 2019 as part of the first cohort of the Executive Ordination Track at Yeshivat Maharat, a program designed to bring qualified mid-career women into the Orthodox rabbinate. Miriam's academic research interests include 20th century Yiddish literature and culture, Jewish children's literature, and American Jewish literature. She is the author of Never Better, The Modern Jewish Picaresque, which was published by the University of Michigan Press and was the winner of the 2017 National Jewish Book Award in Modern Jewish Thought and Experience. And now Honey on the Page, a treasury of Yiddish children's literature, which just appeared last week. In Honey on the Page, Miriam delivers to students of Jewish history and literary culture a rich resource of Yiddish stories from around the globe, selected and translated by the author. She offers also to Jewish families, educators, and librarians, a treasure trove of Yiddish tales for children of all ages that will illuminate their religious, cultural, and ethical heritage. And in the interviewing role tonight is Professor Marshall Duke, who received his BA in general psychology from Rutgers University in 1964 and his PhD in clinical psychology from Indiana University in 1968. From 1968 to 1970, he served as a clinical psychologist in the U.S. Army Medical Service Corps, and since 1970 has been a member of the psychology faculty at Emory, where he is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of Psychology. In his role as a teacher, as the author of more than 100 research articles and 7 books, and also in his role as a core faculty member of the Emory Center for Myth and Ritual in American Life, or Mariel, Marshall's work has focused on a variety of family issues, and among which are the importance of family stories and rituals in the nurturing of resilience in children. An active public scholar, Marshall and his work have been featured in venues as diverse as the Oprah Winfrey Show, the Wall Street Journal, and Parents Magazine, among many others. When I was an incoming freshman at Emory in the late 1980s, he was famous for giving an orientation week talk to parents in order to calm them down before they had to get back in their car and leave their children at Emory. And it was probably a very tough job, but it worked. And I'm sure he provided that reassurance to dozens of classes of Emory parents. Because of their mutual interest in children and storytelling, Marshall and Miriam, along with another colleague, anthropology professor Mel Connor, collaborated on a project through Emory's interdisciplinary faculty fellowship program several years ago. And as an outgrowth of that project, Miriam and Marshall co-taught a course at Emory viewing Jewish children's literature through various disciplinary lenses. And so these are among the reasons why we felt that Marshall would be an excellent interlocutor in discussing Miriam's book. And so without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Miriam Udel and her capable interviewer, Marshall Duke.
Thank you, Eric. Hi, Miriam. I want to wish everybody a good evening and welcome to this wonderful event. I'm really excited about this book coming out because I feel like I've been part of the birth of the book, as well as the birth of Miriam's youngest baby child, who was with Miriam before in the class. That's right. So we're going to talk about this book, and I know that you're going to enjoy it when you get it. We're going to try and give you a feel for what the book is about. And I'm going to start at the very, very beginning, and that is looking at this book. I think it is straight, and it's called Honey on the Page. So the first thing that I want to ask Miriam is, what is this title all about? Some of you may know if you go back to the Cheder days, but what is it? What does Honey on the Page refer to, Miriam? Why this title?
So thank you. That is a great starting question, Marshall, and I will answer it in just a moment, but I have learned from the presidential candidates that I actually don't have to answer questions at all, or certainly when they're asked. So I will first just take a moment to say how really grateful and delighted I am to be doing this event under the auspices of the Tam Institute for Jewish Studies, because this book turned out to be a very beautiful object with these illustrations and this beautiful cover and jacket. And the book was able to be published as it was because of really generous subvention funding from the Tam Institute. So to be able to now celebrate with the book in hand, with the people who made it possible and with all of you means a great deal. So yes, the custom of smearing honey on the page of a primer goes back to the traditional Jewish site of primary education, the cheder, the Yiddish word for room, because these were informal institutions that were often just the malamed, the teacher's room, where students as young as 4 or 5, in some places even 3, would come in without much of a formal procedure. And in order to make the beginning of learning sweet, the malamed would smear honey on the page and the child would lick it up and sort of symbolically incorporate that sweetness into their bodies and into the learning process. So I wanted to put that Yiddish honey on the page. And I talk a little bit in the introduction about how when I started Hebrew school, I was 9. I had already been in Sunday school for a while, learning a lot of Jewish content, but I only started learning the Hebrew language at 9 years of age. And my teacher, Mrs. Wasserman, explained to us about this custom, but she didn't want to deal with honey in a modern classroom. And so she came around to everyone's desk with a little cascade of chocolates that she would pour onto each person's book. And I still have my primer, and you can't see any evidence of the chocolate, but the sweetness of the whole venture really did make quite an impression.
Wonderful. It's a great tradition. And I know that some people will give lollipops or other sweets on the first day of class to make that association, but it's a wonderful image of having the page being a source of sweetness. And I think that this book is, in fact, that. It's a source of sweetness for many reasons, not only the content of the stories, which we'll get to, but also the fact that you have brought to light in English stories that have been unavailable to us until you've translated them. They are in Yiddish. And before we go any further, I want to talk a little bit about Yiddish, because I know that Yiddish was the secret language in my house when I was a child. It was the language my grandparents spoke to one another and to my mother when they didn't want me to understand what they were saying. So many people probably have had that experience. So I can understand a lot of Yiddish. I can't speak Yiddish, but I had to learn it to be able to know what they were saying. But Yiddish was a language that was studied less and less. There were fewer and fewer speakers. But in the history of memory, we had a period of time when Yiddish was taught, and then it wasn't taught. And the interest sort of waned. But Yiddish is coming back. So I wonder if you just speak to that for a few moments about why is Yiddish becoming so popular again? How are people learning it? Where is it being kept? Where is the sort of lock box for Yiddish? Where is it? Where is it right now?
Sure. So first of all, it's important to note that a number of people that's very difficult to pinpoint, but is probably somewhere between 500,000 and 700,000 Hasidic Jews use Yiddish, known as the Mama Loshen, the mother tongue, as their first language, and have been doing so continuously since before World War II. And there's that community has, for unfortunate reasons, been much in the news lately in New York, in Williamsburg and Borough Park. But that fellowship of Hasidic Yiddish speakers also stretches to Europe, to Antwerp, to parts of Bnei Brak. There are Jews in various pockets throughout the world for whom Yiddish is not only a living language, but is their primary everyday language. So that's always important to note. But apart from that, the tradition of more secular or other than Hasidic Yiddish is also really flourishing. And there is absolutely a renaissance underway. There is an all digital Yiddish journal called In Geweb, on the web, or in a web, in a network. And In Geweb now publishes a roundup every spring, every May or so, of that year's summer Yiddish programs, many of which are intensive programs. There are multiple places where an interested young adult or less young adult can go and study Yiddish, and many, many people are. I've had the privilege of teaching at the Yiddish Book Center over the last few summers, and I've had students come for a first summer of beginner level instruction and then come back the next summer and then perhaps complete a fellowship at the Yiddish Book Center or continue their studies at the YIVO Institute in New York or in the program in Tel Aviv. So there's a sense of a lot going on. There's Yiddish theater happening, being made again. The Yiddish Fiddler on the Roof production was expected to last maybe a month, and it went on for something like a year and a half. It was an extraordinary run. There's all kinds of art being produced, all kinds of music being produced in Yiddish. Daniel Kahn and the Painted Bird and other projects like that incorporate Yiddish. So there's really a sense among many different kinds of people that Yiddish is a portable homeland and that it is a way of connecting with Yiddishkeit, with Jewishness and the sort of large Jewish narrative.
So you learned Yiddish and you became a translator, which is in itself an incredible achievement, because translation is very, very hard, as anybody who's tried to do that would know. And you have selected from among all the things you could translate, children's stories for one, and then children's stories in a specific period of time in history. So I wonder if you would tell us something about the nature of Yiddish children's stories, and also what time period did you select and why? Why you went to this group of stories? Why are they important?
So in Eastern European Jewish culture, originally there was very little sense of age stratification in the ways that people read. You didn't read according to your age. You might read according to your sex, so that if you were male and had an elite education and were able to access Hebrew and Aramaic, you would be expected to occupy your time with Talmud study, with the study of the development of Jewish law. Whereas if you were female, or you were one of what they called the men who were like women, in the sense that they had not had access to this elite education, then you might read simpler texts that were written in Yiddish, storybooks, chapbooks, books like the Bova Buch, which is a kind of chivalric romance and the real source of the expression Baba Mices. They really have nothing to do with bubbies. They come from the Bova Buch. You might read the Tzenorena, known as the Women's Bible, which is a collection of midrashim, of rabbinic interpretations of the weekly Torah portion. There are all sorts of books that were being read by women, by non-elite men, and by the young children who were still kind of in the orbit or in the ambit of these reading women. And it was really a much later development that there was a concerted effort to create a literature, a set of texts that would address children specifically. And it came about, as many things do in Yiddish culture, because of politics, because there was a wide range of ideological commitments that expressed themselves along a spectrum of political parties that ranged from what we might call just Yiddish, which is kind of analogous to how some people today say that they're just Jewish, to socialist-oriented Zionism, to Bundism, to full-fledged communism. And each of these kind of ideological stripes had a party, a political party associated with it. This is true in Poland, this is true in New York. And each of these political parties eventually came to have a network of schools that was associated with it. And those schools and school systems required reading materials. So that's one of the sort of engines that's pushing the development of this literature. And then the other one I would say, also stepping back a little bit historically, any corpus of children's literature is marked and shaped by the moment of its founding. So the Brothers Grimm went out into the German countryside and collected oral tales, folk tales, and wrote them down, and over 7 editions, over 50 years, refined them into what are now known as the Tales of the Brothers Grimm. And that all unfolded against the backdrop of German nationalism and attempts to really pull together a kind of centralized German identity around storytelling and the transmission of a cultural heritage to children and to the next generation. So that happens much later in Yiddish and in a somewhat different way. But the forces of Yiddish cultural nationalism are really, really active in the first decades of the 20th century. And so cultural leaders start to realize that they need to address children specifically. They need to do it in order to both preserve the Yiddish language and to extend their own political views and commitments to the next generation. They realize they need to do this really in the second decade of the 20th century, in the teens. And it's during the 1920s, in the period between the world wars, in the 1920s and the 1930s, this literature starts to burgeon with the founding of multiple publishing houses, again, associated with these political parties and their school systems. And by 1935, it's absolutely galloping. And so that's a very exciting period, that time in the 20s and into the 30s. And then a lot of because of Jewish migration patterns, a lot of the activity is already taking place in the Americas, in both North America and South America, Latin America, by the 1930s. But as you would imagine and expect, the Holocaust poses the most terrible interruption to everything that was going on in Europe. And the literature takes a while. I mean, it continues to be published in the Americas, but it takes a while to sort of get its bearings again. And then in the 50s, we see a real efflorescence as Yiddish children's literature kind of reconstitutes itself as a force for cultural preservation and consolidation of what it means to be Jewish after the Holocaust. And that continues. It slows down a bit, as you would imagine, because of those linguistic assimilation patterns that you mentioned, Marshall, but it continues into the 1970s and maybe even into the 1980s a little bit. In the anthology, it's represented as going into the 1970s.
So one of the things I was struck with, just a quick comment about this, is how many copies of these things were printed and sold back in the 1920s. I imagine that most of our listeners would think it's a small number, but in fact, it wasn't. What would be some of the publication numbers for some of these stories?
So in the United States, it was not customary to include the size of the run, the size of the tirage or print run in the copyright information. So for the ones in the United States, there's more spade work still to be done in getting those numbers. I need to be able to get to YIVO once again and look at the records of the various publishing houses. But in the work that was published in Yiddish in the USSR, it was conventional to actually put the print size as part of the copyright information. And so we see runs of 3,000, 3,500, 5,000, 10,000, and with one particular figure who's well represented in Honey on the Page, Leib Kvitko, who was the foremost among the Soviet Yiddish children's authors. He had print runs that topped out around 10,000, which is still pretty respectable in Yiddish, but then he was taken up by a figure named Kornei Shuchovsky and translated into Russian. And the same stories that were being printed in Yiddish in the tens of thousands were suddenly printed in Russian in the millions. There were 10 million copies of one of his books in Russian. So these are cultural productions that, through patterns of migration and translation, really had legs, even at the time of their original publication, far beyond what we might surmise from the print runs.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about some of the writers who wrote stories, as you say in your preface, for children, but very often they were not for children, they were about children. And sometimes they were for both children and for adults, so-called bisemic, having dual levels, two different levels of meaning, that a child might read a story and get one thing, but the adult reading the story to the child gets something very different. And this was purposeful. And some of the authors did not write for children, they wrote for adults. But it was children's literature defined as being either for or about children.
Marketed
so I wonder
to children.
Yes. So would you just, you mentioned one of the writers. Who would be 3 or 4 of the most important figures in children's literature of the time, the Yiddish literature?
Sure. So Leib Kritko, in part because of the quality of what he wrote, and in part because of those numbers that I just mentioned, he would be a very important figure. Somebody in the book who is just probably the best known writer as a writer is Sholem Asch, who he wrote the kinds of stories that you're talking about that are bisemic. There's one that I included called The Magnate of Jerusalem, which is about a wealthy man who is really righteous, and he really strives to be righteous, and he keeps a careful accounting of his deeds, and he gives a lot of charity to the poor of his town and to itinerant beggars who come through. And one night he's kind of sitting there going over his business accounts and then his spiritual accounts, and a poor beggar comes to the door, and the man really smells. And the master of the house says to his servants, you know, go get him bathed, take him out of here. He really smells, and give him a meal to eat. And then, you know, he can come back and talk to me after he smells better. And from that day, for reasons he can't really begin to fathom, he starts to encounter mishaps in his business life. His ships run aground, and his caravan is taken hostage for a ransom. And there are all kinds of setbacks and reversals. And he says, it's okay, it's just money. If God doesn't want me to be the steward of this money, of this fortune anymore, that's all right. And then his daughter, his young daughter, to whom his soul is bound, gets sick and dies. And he realizes that this isn't just about money, and that something's gone wrong. He's done something. He's accountable in some way. And he tries to search out his deeds, and he can't figure it out. So he does the only thing that makes sense to him, which is to leave his wife and surviving children a fortune so that they can continue to be supported in the manner to which they're accustomed, and to trade in his finery for burlap sack, and to go out as an itinerant beggar into the world to just learn about God's world. And he falls in with other beggars, and at first he's very meticulous, and then Ash repeats a couple of times that he kind of lost track of how he smells, because when the smell is on your own body, you don't sense it. And he went here and there wherever the wind blew him, and then he started hearing about a new magnate, a new rich man whose fortune had been made in Damascus. And so he was the magnate of Jerusalem, and everyone teases him, what are you, the magnate of Jerusalem? You know, back when he was quite fastidious about his appearance. And he ends up going on a pilgrimage to visit the magnate of Damascus. And of course, when he gets there to the home of the magnate of Damascus, he smells and he has like suppurating wounds and he's gross. And so the magnate of Damascus quite naturally tells his servants, you know, take him into the other room and let him have a bath before he has an audience with me. And all of a sudden he understands, right? He understands what he did wrong and how he brought this on himself. And when I read that story, I don't feel like I'm reading a Yiddish children's story. I feel like I'm reading a story by Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian fiction writer who has all of these recursive plots and kind of meta events that, you know, somebody is dreaming another person into being, and reality gets really wobbly. And so when I read that kind of a story, I'm seeing something a lot more complex than just a nice story for kids about how important it is to really empathize with the poor.
Mm-hmm. And so this is a kind of story that as you said, is very complex and has a fairly high level message to it. There are some others that are like that are presented in a very frivolous way. I think of the Helm stories that I think children love, our students love these stories. I wonder if you might just say a word about the Helm stories, or maybe even give us an example of one there from the book.
Sure. So I will note parenthetically that when Marshall and I taught this seminar together about children's literature, we always gave our students the option of doing a creative final assignment. And we always got excellent Helm stories. Sometimes they had been transposed to India or to Emory, right? All different kinds of places. But Helm it's a real place, but the Helm motif has very little to do with the real location in Poland. But it's a town of fools, and fools who have really impeccable logic within the general topsy-turviness of all of their assumptions. So if you just take everything and turn it upside down, then they can reason perfectly within that upside down world. So I have a section of the book called Wise Fools, and there are several Helm stories, but there's one, and here I'm going to take the opportunity to kind of give a shout out to the excellent translator, Paula Cohen, who created this really delightful cutaway. And the people that we see here are a man named Avram and his wife Myrtle. And they live in this cottage that has a door that bolts, and they forgot to bolt the door, and it's a very windy night. And the door is flapping and flapping and making a whole racket, and they can't sleep. And so one turns to the other and says, go down and close the door. No, 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 you go down and close the door. And they get into a little spat that's familiar to anyone who has ever lived with an intimate other. And they cut a deal. The first one to talk has to go shut the door. Neither one of them wants to get out of their warm beds. And so some robbers come in and they see this open door. They say, well, what if somebody's home? And the other one says, obviously no one's home because that banging door would wake the dead. So they clean the place out. And the next morning, Avram and Myrtle wake up and they don't even have a pan left to cook breakfast in. And I'm not going to tell you the rest because you're going to want to read it for yourselves and find out who cracks first, bringing about the conclusion that I used as the title of the story, A Deal's a Deal.
The Helm stories are wonderful. They've been made into plays and stories, puppet shows, all sorts of things. And people can relate to these stories very, very easily. You mentioned a theme also several times already, the wind. So many of the stories go from people to natural forces, snow, wind. There's one of the students' favorite stories, which the Weber School kids actually put on as a play. It was called The Wind That Got Angry.
Right. So this is a story by Moshe Kulbach, who is one of the greatest Yiddish writers of the Soviet period, who wrote mostly for adults. But one of the kind of exciting features of Jewish literature, whether it's in Yiddish or in Hebrew, is that in the phrase of somebody talking about American children's literature, majors wrote for minors, meaning the most high culture literary practitioners would often try their hand at writing at least something for children. So Moshe Kulbach wrote this fantastic story about the wind that got angry, where right off the bat, you are asked to sympathize somewhat counterintuitively with the winter wind, who's not normally a sympathetic figure, right? Usually we suffer because of the blowing of the winter wind. But when we meet the winter wind, it's the beginning of spring, and there's been an early thaw, and the wind was resting somewhere, and it's been chased away by this thaw, which endangers its very life. And the wind goes out to the fields looking for refuge, and it approaches the oak tree. And the oak says, no, you're freezing my roots, you have to go away. And he approaches the rock, and the rock says, no, I'm dried out from the winter, I'm about to crack, you have to go away. And the wind blows into the inn, and the innkeeper comes and slams the door against the wind. And so finally, rejected everywhere with nowhere to turn, the wind goes out into the middle of the field and whips up this gorgeous, furious, just lyrically described blizzard. And I think it's a tantrum story. It's a story about somebody who's pre-verbal or non-verbal, who doesn't have the resources to say how they're feeling, who instead acts out how they're feeling upon the world. And the wind finally is able to kind of recover himself, because we find out that there is a single mom at the edge of the village who has her 2 kids, and they're scared and they're cold, and they send her out to reason with the wind. And she tries the first time, and the wind shoves snow in her face, and she says, please, for the sake of the little children. And then the wind calms down and everything returns to normal.
It's a wonderful story, and as you say, kids can relate to it because it's not about kids, but it's a tantrum, all right. There's no question about that. So I just want to say to the people who are listening in, we're going to open up for questions in just a few minutes. So if you have some, please put them in the Q&A box. I don't think that we can complete our conversation without talking about Lopsik, who is one of the favorite characters. This is Lopsik in Yiddish. Tell us about he's a socialist dog, is this right?
He's a communist dog.
Communist dog.
So in 1935, a writer named Chaver Paver, that was a pen name, published 12 linked stories about Lopsik and the family that lives in Brownsville, the family of Berel the operator, which is the sewing machine operator, that adopts Lopsik during the nadir, the worst period of the Great Depression. Lopsik's family can no longer afford to feed him, and so they leave him with a note around his neck in the elevated station at Jackson Avenue elevated station. And so Berel decides to make his family happy by taking this dog home to them. And so we meet Berel, and we meet his sprightly, indefatigable wife, Molly, and we meet their brave son, Mulik, and their sweet, tender, lively daughter, Rivka. And Lopsik goes along on all of their adventures, and he learns about things like police brutality, about striking for better labor conditions, about peaceful protest marches, and everything that would have been on the minds of leftists during the 1930s. And in the final chapter, Lopsik goes along with Berel. He sneaks along for the March on Washington of 1932. So those are some of Lopsik's adventures. And watch this space, meaning the TAM Institute, because we are just getting going on a project, a collaboration with Theater Emory. We are hoping to actually produce a puppet play this spring adapted from these Leipzig stories.
They're wonderful stories, and those are the ones that are so clearly bysemic that it's for everybody. And he's a good character, and there are wonderful illustrations in many of these stories. In addition to the illustrations that your co-author created, many of the Yiddish books had these wonderful illustrations. Here's an example of the original.
Right. So Leipzig was illustrated by Lou Boonen, who is an incredibly talented artist and animator who was eventually blacklisted as a communist.
So here is Eric, who's come back to help us with the Q&A.
Great.
Yes. Okay. So we're getting a few questions, and others should feel free to add some questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. From Paul Wolpe, you caught his attention with the discussion of the Chelm stories, and he asked, do you have any idea how they originated? And my own addition to that question is, what did the town of Chelm do to deserve becoming such a focus of Jewish folk culture?
Right. So I would actually refer you with all of your good, historical Chelm questions. There's a wonderful monograph that Ruth von Bernuth at the University of North Carolina wrote called How the Wise Men Got to Chelm. And she answers all that and more. I'm trying to remember what she said about the original appellation of these as Chelm stories, because clearly the tradition of this kind of storytelling predates the kind of Yiddish attachment of it to Chelm. It has German cognates, it has other European cognates. So all answers are in How the Wise Men Got to Chelm by Ruth von Bernuth.
Very good. Maida Miller refers to the Volksbühne and the Yiddish theater and the fact that they often do performances for children. And so is there a tradition of Yiddish children's drama?
There is. It really came through the tradition of Purim theatricals, when it was customary to enact the sale of Joseph narrative or the story of Purim itself. And it quickly moves into other realms, some of which are more political satire aimed at adults and some of which are more aimed at children. One of the figures represented in the volume, although not exactly for this thing, is Eliezer Steinberg, who was a lifelong educator in Jewish schools, who wrote mostly fables. I have his story of how the birds learned Genesis and Bible stories through an avian lens, but he also wrote theatricals for children. There were a number of plays that I read. Unfortunately, the dialogue from the plays has not aged very well. When I went to translate it, some of it sounded kind of wooden, and so I did not end up including any plays in the volume, but they're there. If somebody can make them sing in the 21st century, they should absolutely take them up.
So the plays that the Volksbühne does are kind of their own adaptations of things for modern children.
Yes, I've caught some of their kind of folkloristic plays, but I haven't managed to see anything specifically for children. So I'm not sure. I saw their production a few years ago of Herschel Ostropolyer, who is a beloved folkloristic figure in Yiddish culture.
From Didem Uka, forgive me if I'm getting your name wrong.
Hi, Didem, Ucha.
Ucha, okay. Didem asks about the tradition of the Grimm's fairy tales and how they often had sort of shocking aspects of violence that readers were surprised by, or students of German are surprised by. So one question, and I'm sort of amplifying a little bit, but is there something similar in Yiddish? And also, the other part of the question is, were there certain stories that you wanted to include, but that you decided not to because there was a kind of disconnect between the themes and their, the inability to translate them for modern readers?
These are great questions, and I would be very remiss having this conversation with Marshall and not addressing what I'm about to say. So when I say that a literary corpus is marked by, and particularly for children, is marked by the moment of its founding, one of the most significant things I think about the Yiddish children's corpus as a distinctive entity is that because it's growing in the 1920s, it's growing and burgeoning at a time when the early ideas of child psychology are really becoming very widespread. And there's really a sense about, I think there's a beginning of a sense about trauma and not wanting to traumatize children through their reading. I think that over the life of this literary corpus, we really see a shift from the ethos of scaring children away from doing wrong toward modeling the right thing to do. So now kind of moving to the second part of the question, I was very aware of trying to create a collection that would be a resource for contemporary families. And so it does err, if it's an error at all, it errs more on the side of that latter, more contemporary sense of stories that model the right kinds of behavior, that model kindness and ethical action that children can undertake on their own initiative. I could have had a parallel volume, and in my mind, I have a parallel volume called Nicht für Kinder, not for children, right? With all of the fantastically well-written stories that are completely inappropriate for today's children. So an example of one that I translated, a little girl is in Russia going with her mom for the summertime from the city out to the dacha in the countryside. And in the hubbub and tumult of the train station, they get separated and the mom takes the wrong little girl with her onto the train. And this little girl is left all by herself, abandoned in the train station. And she starts to cry and she's paralyzed and everybody stops and they try to elicit some information. What's her name? What are her parents' names? What's her address? And she can't talk. She's just too choked up with fear and anxiety and just utter paralysis. And then all of a sudden, she looks over toward the window and she sees something on the wall and she breaks out in smiles because she spotted her friend, and she goes over and she's so relieved and she regains her faculty of speech, and all the adults follow her eyes and they see the portrait on the wall of Papa Stalin, the great friend and defender of children everywhere. So, this is a story that's published in 1940 by Leib Kvitko. And for us, knowing what Stalin was going to do, which was have Kvitko executed on the night of the murdered poets, August 12th, 1952, 12 years after the story is published, it's a horror to read this. So I didn't end up including it, but I do teach it.
Wonderful. Marshall, do you have anything you want to add, especially around the Grimm's fairy tale tradition? And
I would want to go to the next question.
okay.
But I do want to come back to a question about translation and the difficulties of translation. But I want to be sure we get to the questions here.
Okay, so from Jake Krakowski, we have a question. It seems like almost every great modern Yiddish writer chose to write for children at some point. Is Yiddish a unique body of literature in this way? And what does that tell us about Yiddish literature more broadly?
So Jake, since you're here, I can call out by name that Jake, who is a 2014 alumnus of Emory and of the Theater Studies program, is going to be my co-conspirator in bringing Leipzig to new life on the puppet stage in English. So I'm really excited to be embarking on that with you. So I would say that it is, if not unique, a distinctive feature of the modern Jewish literary complex, by which I mean particularly stories in both Yiddish and Hebrew, that whether somebody goes on to write a lot of children's literature or not, they at least try writing something. It was almost seen as kind of a civic duty of Yiddish cultural nationalism and of early Zionism, that you have to write something for the children of the nation.
Very good. Okay, from Esther Crewman, we have a question. In America, I typically see children's literature perceived as a women's field, albeit a male-dominated one. Did Yiddish children's literature offer opportunities to Jewish women writers and storytellers?
So it absolutely did. I was hoping at the outset of my project that I would be able to have gender parity in my table of contents. I was not able to. I think I have 8 women out of maybe 27 contributors. But I tried to balance that a little bit by having the longest piece in the book be by Sina Rabinovich. So insofar as women became involved, they weren't initially the teachers at Yiddish shulas, Yiddish secular oriented schools, but they came to be. And I do have 2 stories by Sarah Liebert, who was the first, she attended Teachers College, and she was the first female teacher in New York's Yiddish school system. Insofar as women became important in Yiddish cultural education, they also became important in writing for children. I will also say that this is a gender bias that I come up against every so often, not only in the world of the primary texts, but also in the scholarship and the assumptions about the scholarship of these texts, and that the follow-up to Honey on the Page that I'm working on now is a critical study that will hopefully make the case once and for all that we actually need to delve into this literature and children's culture more broadly if we are going to achieve a full understanding of Jewish modernity. It's actually essential to understand these experiences of women and of children, because everybody that you know who goes on to do and say important things worth studying as an adult was a child at some point.
Thank you. From Ofra Yeglin, do you plan to translate the stories into Hebrew and to publish the book in Israel?
When I find the right collaborator, I need someone who has more native fluency in Hebrew, but I would love to work with that person when we find them.
Miriam, I'd like to get in a question of my own if I could. I'm always thinking about the different contexts for Jewish life and Jewish culture and how place, shapes Jewish culture in different ways. Since your book is a book that deals with many different contexts and locations in which Yiddish literature was produced, did you see any significant differences between, say, how Yiddish children's literature took shape in New York as opposed to Poland or the Soviet Union?
So there's a great little case study for that with a couple of authors that I've already mentioned. My verbrennte Kommunisten, my ardent communists on either side of the globe, right? When we look at the body of work of Leib Kvitko, the one who wrote the story about the little girl who finds Stalin in the train station, who also wrote, Leib Kvitko always wrote stories with deficient or entirely absent parents, because the state was really going to be the true parent who is capable of giving care and kind of shaping the minds of children. On the other hand, when we look at Leipzig, when we look at Chaver Paver, it's so bouncy and bright and optimistic, and the family is this perfectly functioning little micro democracy. And you really get a sense of two authors with very similar political commitments. They look very similar on paper as two ardent communists who create worlds that are affectively so different from one another because culture and place really do matter. And an American communist story really feels different than a Soviet communist story.
So Eric, if I might to
Please.
have a final question as well for Miriam. Miriam, I mentioned about the translations, and translations are difficult, needless to say. But one of the things that impressed me a great deal was how you somehow found it possible to create rhymes in the poems. They rhymed in Yiddish.
They rhyme in Yiddish.
Clearly,
they rhyme in my book.
They rhyme in your book, which is an achievement in its own right, because it's very difficult to do that. I wonder if you might read to us where stories come from.
I was
on
just
page
going to
151.
I was going to propose that.
I think that'd be a wonderful
closing.
final
That would be perfect.
gift to us.
And it comes with this beautiful original illustration that appeared with the Yiddish poem by Ida Maze, who is a Polish-born poet who emigrated to Montreal and wrote in Yiddish. And this is marked Ballad. Somewhere very far away where wagons will not go, there stands a little cottage as it stood for years, just so. Sitting quiet and abandoned, doors and shutters bolted shut, days and years pass, only wind blows through the chimney of the hut. Everybody's known for years, its people all have gone away. Only wind blows in the chimney, not a soul has come to stay. One night, when all are sleeping, and the wind is sleeping too, lights come on inside the cottage, and smoke wafts up the flue. Door and shutter are unbolted. In a corner by a light sits a grandpa learning Torah. A child listens with delight to grandpa's tales of wonder beams, absorbs them through her dreams. Hard by the hearth, a spinning wheel from silken thread so thin and soft, grandma spins her lovely stories and with the smoke sends them aloft. The smoke takes up the grandma's stories, repeats them to a wind beguiled. On its wings, the wind will spread them, giving some to every child.
A beautiful poem. Thank you. Eric?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Miriam. This has been a wonderful introduction to your book, and I know we all look forward to following it up with a closer examination. Marshall, thank you for your wonderful questions. Thanks everyone for attending, and we remember to look out for your follow-up email tomorrow with details about how to purchase the book and how to get your book plate and bookmark. And we thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you again at future programs. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.